I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This interview features two guests instead of the usual one, and those guests are Lottie and Connor, founders of Earthly Biochar. Maybe you already use biochar in the garden. Maybe you've heard of it but aren't quite sure what it does or how it works, or maybe you're completely new to it as a concept. In any case, I'm sure you'll learn such a lot from this interview. The interview starts with Connor describing the beginnings of his and Lottie's journey into biochar.
We were quite concerned about climate change and we wanted a way to use our entrepreneurial spirit to do something about it. So we found out about biochar through chance, really, and we were sort of blown away by what it could do for the climate and how effective it can be for soil health. So the story goes, I was studying a product design degree and I needed a final year project to do, and I wanted something that had an impact on the environment. So when I was looking around for ideas, I met a guy who was studying biochar at a permaculture society, and he wanted a way of making it himself at home, but he didn't know how to build a kiln. He didn't really have the tools or the skills necessary to do it. And after I told him I was doing product design, he asked me to look into it for him. At the time, I hadn't heard of biochar, so I wasn't immediately interested in it. But when I pretty much had no product ideas, I just Googled what biochar was, and I found a TED talk on it. And I found out it was carbon negative, so it could sequester carbon and help with taking it out of the atmosphere. And it was this amazing soil enhancer. So I typed in biochar kiln for sale and nothing came up. So the next morning I went down to my lecturer and I said, I've got this biochar thing. I don't really know much about it. And, I'm not sure if it's going to work. And she was like, yeah, do that one. No one's done anything like that before. So I was pretty terrified. But 9 months later, messing around with sort of bean cans and oil drums and making prototypes, I designed a back garden biochar maker. And we have to do an exhibition to the public at the end of our degree show. And when I was showing it to people, ended up getting 15 people to sign up to buy it. And at that stage, we thought, okay, maybe this is the climate-friendly business idea we were looking for. So one of our lecturers came up to me and said, your project's really interesting. Can we co-author a research paper on it? And to do that, we needed to do a grow test. So we were going to have like 20 radishes on a windowsill. I needed to source some compost. So I was ringing up local plant nurseries, trying to get hold of some free, good quality compost. And on the fourth one, I rang up Kings Park Nursery in Bournemouth, and the nursery manager called Chris Evans. He picked up and he said, what do you need this compost for then? And I said, I'm doing this trial on biochar. Have you heard of it? And he hadn't heard of it, but he invited me round. I told him about it, showed him my kiln, and he said, right, I'll run your grow test for you, but instead of 20 plants, we'll do it on 400 plants, and he'll pay for and manage everything. So that was an amazing, unexpected outcome. We ended up testing. I made the biochar in my prototype that I designed. I charged it up with a compost tea and drove down to Bournemouth, and we mixed it into their compost, which they just buy in 17-litre bags at a rate of 10% by volume. We potted up 400 plants, 3 different types, just bedding plants, wallflower, daisies, can't remember the other one, and went home and then came back in 3 weeks' time just to see if there had been any effect. And I'm totally honest, I was quite scared. I was like, have I just introduced lots of diseases in his greenhouse? Is this going to ruin his plants? But when I got there, it was visibly different and he was extremely impressed. And he said, roughly, we sped up the plants by about a week. So after that successful grow test, we did another one, but on 4,000 plants. And then we planted them into bedding, into actual beds in Bournemouth Lower Gardens. And when that one went really well as well, he asked us to supply him with a yearly supply. So when we tried to find that, we realized that no one was making it out of local resources at the price and the quality and the sustainability criteria that we needed. So we needed to be certain that it was carbon negative, made out of waste resources, so we weren't chopping down a forest to make it, and made in a process which doesn't produce smoke. And when we found that gap, we realized that if we wanted biochar to come to realization and actually have the impact we wanted it to have, we would have to set up the UK's production infrastructure. So we never intended to do that. To be honest, we didn't want to do that because it was quite a scary idea having, machinery and land. But as we got more and more concerned about climate change, we just decided we were going to commit it. So I'll let Lottie describe what happened after that.
Okay, cool.
So I think that was about a year ago when we decided that we were going to set up the UK's biochar production infrastructure. And we also started getting more inquiries for ready-made biochar. And we won a place on an accelerator program up in London, and that gave us a small cash injection into our startup of about £5,000, and enabled us to finalise the kiln prototypes, and that's now live, and also enabled us to kind of delve a bit deeper into what could the UK's production infrastructure look like. And through reaching out to people, we met an amazing professor at Reading University, and that relationship has now evolved to me doing a PhD with him on biochar, working with farms across the country to actually kind of start quantifying the real impacts that biochar can have both economically and environmentally on farming businesses in the UK. So, fast forward a year, we're at a point where we're making and selling biochar on a small scale, and we also sell our kilns, and I'm doing a PhD and working with lots of farms.
Cool. Well, there's quite a lot in that I've got questions about. So the first one was that you mentioned, Connor, that you charge it up with compost tea. What does that involve, and why is that important?
So biochar is like a battery. You need to load it up with nutrients before you add it to soil. So if we were doing this grow test and we added uncharged, we call it raw biochar, into the potting mix, there was a chance that it would absorb nutrients and water from the compost as kind of stealing it from the plants. And this could negatively impact the plant's growth until the battery was charged, the biochar was charged. So there are so many different ways to charge biochar, but because we needed to do it in a rapid turnaround, we took finished compost from a local gardener who makes really good organic compost. We added it to rainwater. We put a bit of molasses, so sort of unrefined sugar, in the container, and we bought some aquarium air pumps, and we bubbled this mixture up, like kind of strange. And what this did is it took the microbes in the compost. We fed them sugar, so that's one bit of their food, and then we fed them oxygen, and we basically just multiplied them. And then once we had a good compost tea, you can tell it's good by the sort of frothiness, the sort of foam on the top. We steeped our biochar in that, like a tea bag sort of thing. And then all of those nutrients and bacteria became absorbed into that. And we soaked that in there for about 6 or 7 hours. And then we drained as much of the liquid as we can. And then took that to the plant nursery where we mixed it into compost.
Mm-hmm. And would it matter if what you were using as the compost tea as the source of the, as a green material? Because I'm thinking, obviously, you trialled it by the sounds of it on bedding plants. I wondered what the effects were if you put it on leafy crops, and whether it mattered, for example, if you used a comfrey tea or a nettle tea, and the effect that had on particular types of plants.
Yeah, so the main thing is that you just charge it up with nutrients, so depending on obviously what the plant needs, and then also just putting bacteria, so fungus and other bacteria in there. So what we do now is instead of doing a compost tea, which kind of it takes a bit of time, we actually buy a powder which is used in hydroponics, and that has suspended 12 different types of bacteria and mycorrhizal in it with some other trace elements. And when we add that to water, those microbes sort of reanimate, and then we add some liquid seaweed into that, and then soak our biochar into that. So we'll just put that in a watering can and then pour that over the biochar in a bucket, just mix that up. We don't even soak it for that long, and then we'll then mix that into compost. I don't know if you have anything to add on different plants requiring different things.
I think if you are planting with specific plants, like Connor said, just bear in mind of what you're actually going to be growing using the biochar. So if you've got a plant that needs a lot of nitrogen, then make sure the compost tea that you're soaking your biochar in has the correct kind of NPK ratios for that plant. But other than that, I haven't actually heard of any specific requirements for, I think the only thing, because biochar is made from wood, it has a really amazing porous structure, which is why it acts like this sponge in the soil. There is one requirement if you're planting larger species. So if you're planting trees, you want your biochar to be slightly larger just because the roots are larger. But other than that, there aren't really any kind of specific requirements for the different plants that you're planting with.
Mm-hmm. So you provide the biochar or facilitate people making it themselves, and then they do the compost tea process?
Yes, and when we sell our biochar, we sell the powder with it. So you can make up the microbial solution at home, because lots of people don't always have access to that kind of product. So we have that. That just comes with the biochar as standard.
Mm-hmm. So when you did your plant trials, obviously you anecdotally they were about a week further advanced than they would have been had the biochar not been used. Have you done trials to see that in a kind of controlled setting, or is that part of your PhD, Lottie?
That's definitely part of the PhD. The nursery trials on those 4,000 plants, that was I would say semi-controlled environment. It was in large glass houses at a nursery, and they had the same watering and feeding patterns on both the controls and the tests. And we took lots of photographs of the differences in root development as well as above ground growth and flowering. But there wasn't any more kind of lab analysis done after that. So that's why I'm doing the PhD, because I want to look at the increase in biodiversity and microbial populations in the soil as a result of using biochar, and also quantify what happens if we deliberately reduce watering and fertilizer in plants with biochar, and if that sponge effect can still improve the plant's growth even though we're giving them less resources. And that kind of study has been done before. There's a lot of literature out there which suggests that in good quality soil, you can see an increase of about 12% in yield with a reduction in water and feed. But I want to quantify that myself in the UK using plants that we grow here, because a lot of the research has been done in tropical soils, hence why I'm doing this PhD.
Fascinating stuff. So you said about when you make it, you ensure it's made responsibly and it's made with waste resources. What are waste resources?
So the UK, in order for it to be carbon negative, you've got to think about, so there are, in the UK, there's between 5 and 10 million tons of waste wood being generated each year. And you sort of think of this as a ticking carbon time bomb. Most of the time, this wood will end up in landfill or incineration. In landfill, methane is produced as well as CO2, and methane is 25 times worse as a greenhouse gas than CO2. And then in incineration, obviously the carbon goes back into the air. So that's why we want to use waste. So we intercept that carbon before it has a chance to go back into the atmosphere by turning it into biochar. There is an argument so there are people in America who are using free farmland, so things that doesn't compete for food crops, and they're growing things like willow, and they're coppicing it. So they'll plant fields of willow, they'll let it grow to a certain height, and they'll cut it, and then they'll turn that into biochar. So it's sort of like farming carbon from the sky. So at the moment, we want to make use of clean, untreated wood waste. So stuff from furniture factories, untreated pallets, construction demolition waste, things from woodland management. So as we're going and thinning some trees, promoting biodiversity and supporting the ecology in woodlands, there's a lot of biomass that's generated from that, as well as tree surgeons. So we're focusing on waste at the moment because it's a problem. But in the future, we probably could see carbon farming similar to what I described with willow.
Yeah. So when you sent me some information about what you do and your product and all the rest of it, you also sent me some really interesting stuff about how historically biochar has been used, particularly in other countries. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So you had Craig Sams on your show, I think a year ago now, and he did a really good job of talking about how biochar was sort of discovered, talking about terra preta and the link between the Amazon rainforest. So if any of your listeners want to go back and check that, I won't cover that, but things that we can add to are, so the Japanese have a really interesting relationship with charcoal. They have multiple different uses for it. So when they build a house, they will, underneath the floorboards, they will put sacks of charcoal underneath it. And what that does is that is pretty much like a dehumidifier. So as there's too much moisture in the air, the charcoal will absorb that moisture, similar to what it happens in soil. And then so that prevents damp and mold. And then when the air is dry, it will give it back again. So it's a really cool low-tech way of regulating humidity. Another thing they do is they also make into charcoal sort of long branches, and then they'll stick them in the corners of some of their rooms as a form of decoration, but it also passively filters the air. Another thing they do is you'll see some water bottles now with charcoal sticks in them. So they'll have a jug of table water and they'll just stick a lump of charcoal in there, which will remove some of the impurities from the water. Another thing they do is they put the charcoal in breathable sacks and they'll put that in their fridges, in their veg drawers, and that will absorb some of the ethylene gas, which will slow down ripening and increase shelf life of food. I haven't personally tried the fridge experiment yet, but it's something that I'm really interested in. And throughout time, there are still rural Japanese cultures who will use charcoal, biochar, in their food production. So there's a couple of videos on YouTube, but it's very hard to actually find good quality data. But you can see them sprinkling charcoal in ditches, and then they'll cover those ditches with soil. So they've been using it for thousands of years, and we forgot about it as a society, and now it's being rediscovered. Some people call it the oldest thing that you've never heard of. So, yeah.
Yeah, and what's happening in Sweden? I gather they're into it in a big way.
Yeah, so Stockholm have done something interesting. So they won $1 million grant by the Bloomberg Philanthropies in 2014 to set up a biochar production infrastructure there. So they've bought a kiln called a Pyreg, which is a German manufacturer who we're now talking to. And what that does is the citizens and the tree utilities there, they will give their garden waste. They dry that, chip it up, and then put it into the biochar machine. That will then produce biochar. And then the excess heat created from that process will be used to dry the upcoming feedstock. And that will also go to power homes. So they can provide a carbon neutral heating product for residents. And this plugs into a district heating network. And one of their machines can create enough heat to power 182 homes. So they're capturing carbon, they're getting rid of a waste resource. And then they as a thank you for the citizens giving their garden waste, they drop off some garden waste and then they come and pick up biochar in return. And they're doing that at the moment just because they're trying to get the word out. So yeah, that's what they're doing now. And they now have plans to set up 6 of these around Sweden. So they're very progressive, and this is something which we want to learn from and replicate and add to. So that is, we will be putting out a blog on the Stockholm Biochar project. We found some really good PDFs that they've released, as well as an interview with them. So we'll make those available on our Instagram and our website blog.
You assume when you use garden waste, it will be a mixture of not just woody material, but also slightly softer material. Is that still okay for producing the biochar?
Yeah, so if it's made in these large kilns that Sweden have, you can put any biomass in there. So that's anything that's natural and has carbon in it. And there are some kilns that are even designed to take sewage sludge and turn that into biochar. But when you're making it at a small scale in your back garden in our biochar maker, that can only really take just wood waste. And that's because it's really hard to burn kind of wet and green material. But on a large scale, any form of biomass is fine.
Yeah, and I think with the green stuff, the things that are hard to compost, we should make into biochar, but things that are easily composted, I think there's definitely a place for that. And just to clarify on the sewage sludge point, there is evidence to say that there could be heavy metals in that biochar. So, and that biochar won't probably be used for soil applications. That will be used for to be mixed into asphalt or used in insulation or all of these sort of non-soil applications. And there's a document actually which you can find online. It's called 55 Uses of Biochar, and that you'll be amazed at all the different things you can do with it. Just while I'm on that topic, I think I'll just list off a couple of ones that I've got here. So, as I said, it does the stuff in your fridge. It regulates humidity, but you can also put it in your cat litter. So, it will control odors, and they've estimated that if we replace our cat litter, our global use of cat litter, so if we replace 20% of it with biochar, and we can sequester 1.6 million tons of CO2 each year. And this is something which some of our customers are now using. And funnily enough, there's a customer called Concrete Gardener up in Newcastle, and they've just told us that their kitten has started behaving in a much calmer way. So the kitten was really erratic, and as soon as they added biochar, they've calmed down, and we have no explanation for that whatsoever. But that's an unexpected thing. And then other ways to use it in the home. So probably my favorite way to use it is in my kitchen compost bin. So I'll have quite a big compost bin in where I put my veg scraps. And when that gets full, it can really stink. And then when you empty it as well, sometimes that's not very pleasant. So what I will do is I'll sprinkle a layer of biochar in the bottom. I'll add a layer of food scraps, and every so often I'll just cover the top of that with more biochar. So what that does is the smell is methane. And as I said, it's 25 times worse as a greenhouse gas than CO2. So it's really important to try and do something about that. So when you put biochar on top of that, it will absorb some of that methane and stop it from going out, making it a lot more pleasant, and it will absorb the excess liquid as well. And then the benefit is when you take that to your compost bin, you've already mixed biochar into your compost. And with all your other garden waste, eventually you'll have a perfect mix of biochar and compost. And there's one other thing. So with rainwater butts, sometimes they can get a bit stagnant, a bit smelly. And one thing that you can do is you can get a pair of old tights or something permeable like that, fill it up with biochar, put a couple of rocks in it to weigh it down, and then that will passively filter the water and absorb excess nutrients, just to keep it fresher. And then one other thing, so with perlite and vermiculite, biochar can do pretty much the same job, but then you get all these other benefits, including the carbon savings. And there's a really great book for anyone really interested in biochar called Burn: Using Fire to Cool the Earth. It's by Albert Bates and Kathleen Draper. And in that, they talk about something extremely shocking, which I didn't actually know. And so vermiculite mining causes health effects similar to asbestos. So in what once was the world's largest vermiculite mine in America, 400 people have died from asbestos-related diseases. And the Environmental Protection Agency had to pay $120 million to clean up this mine. So there are some potentially negative health implications from its mining. And then, of course, you have to ship that heavy product around the world to your location. So if we can replace at least some of that with biochar, we can have another route for carbon sequestration and potentially avoid some of those negative impacts.
I was just thinking, when you spoke about putting it in water, could it work in a pond where you had too much algae, for instance?
Yeah, so this is an emerging market for biochar is blue-green algae remediation. So when you have algae, like you said, it's just too much nutrients, and you can put big sacks of it along the edges, and it will just passively draw up nutrients. And then depending on what else was in that lake, you can then use that biochar and sell it to a farmer. So there's this great thing, because it has so many uses. You can buy it once and then use it 2 or 3 times. There's even people suggesting that you can rent biochar to some person and then pick it up from them and deliver it to the farmer or something like that.
Yeah. And I was just going to say about helping with too many fertilizers. People have started using biochar, like giant biochar tea bags in rivers, to help absorb excess fertilizer and nutrients. And if you put it directly into the soil, it will stop nutrient runoff as well, because it's very porous and like a sponge. So it's really good at stopping lots of heavy metals and also nutrients running off into our waterways.
And can you have too much of it in your soil?
Yes, you can, like all things. So the optimum rate of biochar application in soil is between 5 and 15%, depending on the health of your soil and the climate. If you go above that, the literature has shown that it starts to have negative effects. I'm not sure why it causes negative effects above that, but I presume it just changes the ecology and the way the soil works. So we always recommend, and what we've tested as well, is an application of 10%. So that's 1 part biochar to 9 parts soil.
There's we've also tried things that require more drainage. Like, people are actually growing cactuses in straight biochar. I mean, I don't necessarily recommend that, but we've been trialing mixing 50-50, so we'll do half biochar, half potting mix. But yeah, the general consensus is around 10%, and that's by volume, not by weight. So yeah.
Okay. Well, fantastic. I could probably speak to you for hours and hours, because this is a fascinating subject. But I realise you haven't got that long. Is there anything else you wanted to add before I let you go?
Just on the sort of climate change side of it, because that is what initially got us into this. The IPCC and Project Drawdown, who are 2 sort of leading climate scientists groups, they have actually put biochar on a list of 76 individual solutions. So biochar is number 55, and they estimate that it can sequester, so reduce or avoid emissions, but 2.2 to 4.4 billion tons of CO2 by 2050. And to put that into context, in 2018, our yearly carbon footprint was 37 billion tons. So that's why there's 76 individual solutions and not just one silver bullet. So 1 kilogram of biochar is equivalent to removing 3 kilograms of CO2 from the air. So yeah, that's just a really exciting prospect, and that's why we're really passionate about it.
Excellent. Lottie, anything else you wanted to add?
The only other thing I'd like to add is that if anyone's listening to this and would like to try out some biochar or a biochar maker, we do have a coupon code for them. So if you'd like to go to our website, which is earthlybiochar.com, you can use the coupon code roots and all, so the same as the podcast name, just as one word and all lowercase, and that'll get you 10% off your orders. But I don't think I've got anything else. But I'd love people to reach out and talk to us and follow us on Instagram and ask questions. That'd be great.
Well, a big thank you to Connor and Lottie for talking to us about biochar and their brilliant new venture, and also for the handy discount code. Links to the Earthly Biochar site are in the show notes, and there's a wealth of information such as how to build your own kiln, guides to all the products, and a webinar that explains even more on the website. Thanks to you as well for listening. Here's Dr. Ian Bedford talking about the most clever and creative of bugs. And apologies to you and Dr. Ian. I gather last week I rudely invaded his segment with my outro music. I'll be going back to edit that out shortly. Thanks to everyone that let me know. Always good to know that some of you are listening to the end. Take care.
In habitats throughout the world, a remarkable 45,000 different species of spider have so far been discovered, and 650 of these reside in Britain. Besides their key features of having 8 legs and a venomous bite, all spiders produce silk, and they use their silk for different purposes, such as creating egg sacs, traversing surfaces, and for wrapping up and storing their food. But probably the most well-known use of their silk is to create webs that are usually suspended between structures for catching their prey. However, not all spiders use webs for this purpose, since some make them into protective canopies for their young, whilst others lay them on the ground, where they work like tripwires to alert the spiders to danger or prey. And there's even spiders that don't make any webs, but just rely on their stealth and camouflage for ambushing their victims. But for those that do make webs, they'll follow a distinct format, ranging from orbs and sheets to lace and funnel shapes. And the web's architecture will often be so unique that it'll reveal the family or even the species of spider that created it. How these spiders instinctively build their webs, though, remains one of the fascinating enigmas of the natural world. But this innate behavioural trait has clearly become hardwired into their DNA over the 100 million years that we know from specimens within ancient amber they've been using silk to trap their prey. Spiders produce their silk from a gland inside their body, and it's stored as a liquid inside their abdomen. Then, when required, the spider uses its rear legs to push the liquid out through tiny pores called spinnerets, where, as it emerges, it rapidly dries into a little silk thread. A thread that research discovered is amongst the strongest and most resilient natural fibre that's ever been found, which unbelievably is 5 times stronger than steel. And when it's made into a mesh, it's tough enough to stop a small bullet. It's also very elastic and incredibly lightweight. So if ways are found to mass-produce spider silk cost-effectively in the future, then our 8-legged acquaintances from the natural world may well have given us all the potential to protect our bodies with clothing that previously might only have been seen in a comic book.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.